Fabulous. Well, hello everyone. Lovely to be able to offer these workshops through Zoom so that we don't have to increase our carbon footprint by trying to help the environment. And so yeah, as Amanda said, my name is Lisa. I'm with my new Environmental Partner Society. I'm the stewardship coordinator there. But so most of my time is spent picking up garbage or pulling invasive plants, some planting, that kind of thing. And I was going to discuss today hedgerows and streamside vegetation, because I love plants, and what they can do for our local environment. Briefly, I'll just talk about hedgerows and streamside vegetation, what it is, why they're fabulous, and then hopefully everybody will want to have a hedgerow at the end of this and just discuss a few things to think about to put in a hedgerow. Hedgerows are basically straight lines of plants, usually woody plants or shrubs and trees. They could be grasses and that type of thing. Those are just more of a vegetated area that gets left, not mowed. So for the most part, we're talking about places that have woody plants growing in them. Usually when most people think about the countryside in England, that's where you usually see a lot of the hedgerows and movies and that type of thing. And they have been around for over 800 years. You can find some 800-year-old hedgerows there. For the most part, they were put in as livestock barriers, so they would have been made with any kind of thorny dead trees stacked along the edge of a field that they wanted to keep sheep in. And then that area, because of all the thorns and dead debris, plants would have started to grow up in those areas, creating the hedgerows that we know today. 800 years ago, we didn't have the invasive species issues that we have now, so when the site would have been left then to just grow, it would have been more of the native plants, of course, not like what we have here. So we got to work a little harder. Your streamside vegetation is basically a hedgerow, but a more sinuous one that's usually following a stream. You can have streamside vegetation, though, along a ditch. Ditches are considered fish habitat if the fish have access to it, or they would flow to fish habitat. So it's still streamside vegetation, even if it's in a straight line along a ditch. The types of plants that you'll grow in these areas are usually just better suited for a wet area. And your streamside vegetation, the buffers are usually much larger than a hedgerow, because of course you'll have plants on both sides of the creek, plus the wetted width of the creek. And then if there's concerns about flooding or anything like that, then it gets even wider. To benefit our local farms, hedgerows are fabulous. They provide shelter and shade, something that's certainly seen through our summers these years. With such hot summers, our livestock do appreciate the shade. They offer a lot more water infiltration. Animals can eat the plants that are growing in a hedgerow, perhaps, if you grow the right stuff. Hedgerows also provide opportunities for habitat for any predators, so any hawks and other raptors that can eat pests like your rats and your mice that you might not want in an area, but it can also be habitat for insects that like to eat other insects that are maybe damaging crops and type of thing. If you have neighbors that complain about noise and odor coming off of your farm, then a hedgerow can help out with that as well. And it's a refuge habitat for your pollinators. If you require pollinators on your farm, they want to be able to get away and find a new space to live. They can live in your hedgerows. Along streams specifically, they certainly can help limit soil erosion along the creeks. The main reason that we're talking about hedgerows and streamside vegetation is because they are really valuable to limit the amount of nutrients that can run off of a property into a creek. They physically can stop some of the sediment and runoff from a property, but because of the roots in the woody plants, the roots will increase infiltration, so that instead of runoff going directly into the creek. They could filter through the ground first and help get rid of some of those excess nutrients. They're also great as protection for your livestock. They can protect animals from the water, which can be dangerous both because of drowning. We have had issues of this in Langley where steep sides of ditches, animals getting stuck in them, which is quite upsetting, but animals that have access to water that might have some sort of waterborne disease in it can also get quite sick. So it's great to keep animals out of that. Ecologically speaking, they can help with carbon sequestration. The hedgerows themselves, the plants can hold carbon, but because they help benefit creation of better soils through like their leaves dropping on the ground and all that kind of stuff, better infiltration, the soils then can also hold more carbon, which is fabulous. They help the creeks, as we mentioned before. They make everything cooler, which happy for the livestock and for us. We want that as well. But when it comes to our groundwater, our drinking water, we can get more infiltration of the water into our groundwater for drinking. Very much ideal for both the creeks and us. As for the actual wildlife species, salmon require cold water. If you get water that starts to go up above 20 degrees Celsius, your fish will start to die, unfortunately. The water doesn't hold as much oxygen for the animals to be able to breathe through their gills. And our pollinators, I'm sure everybody's concerned about pollinators. They need habitat to live in. And when you have a monoculture in a field, if you just have blueberries or something like that, we need a refuge area for our native bumblebees to be able to hang out in when those blueberries are no longer in bloom and they need to find other food. Wildlife can move through these. There's even some studies that show that bats use hedgerows as their highways, their roads, so they can navigate at night. Beyond just that, hedgerows can be very pretty. You can plant just specific plants that will bloom when you want them to. This is a fabulous photo that's from Sutton's. They're a seed company in Britain. And they've created a hedgerow seed package that has their native plants in it. They're beautiful flowers. And as well, if your neighbors are the ones that are producing odors and dust and noise, your hedgerows can help protect you from them. So that, what is it? Strong fences build good neighbors, I think. It's also very romantic though, thinking about these beautiful hedgerows and just stunning, gorgeous. But of course, in Europe, there's been 800 years of maintenance on these hedgerows. There's programs that are organized to make sure that hedgerows are taken care of. We don't have that here. Out here, we have some pretty ugly plants that are part of hedgerows. In this image, you can see Himalayan blackberries that are left on the sides of the roads and between fields. The bottom one is quite upsetting. That one's the Japanese knotweed or knotweed species. And then of course, reed canary grass. These are all very aggressive invasive plants that are difficult to maintain, difficult to get rid of. They certainly are happy if you don't maintain them well. But we could have really pretty hedgerows here if we put in enough time for them so that we don't end up with these messes of invasive plants. So if we have convinced you to put in a hedgerow because they're just so fabulous and you want the romance of sheep running through a field with a hedgerow on the edge, you need to start asking yourself a few fabulous questions. Do you have the space for these things? A hedgerow is generally 3 meters wide. It gets even wider, as I mentioned before, when you put a stream in the middle of that. And where can you put them? Property lines is usually the big one, along roadsides, of course. You could even put them along the side of a building. There's actually some really interesting things that are being done with hedgerows along industrial indoor agricultural buildings to help with the smells and the odors and the dusts that are coming out of the exhaust systems from these buildings. So another a spot for a potential hedgerow could be along the side of a building if you wanted it. Please keep in mind any overhead wires. If you want to choose trees for your hedgerow, you'll definitely want to make sure you're not going to get any of those. When you're deciding what kind of stuff you're going to put into your hedgerow, you can decide, what is the function of your hedgerow? Is it going to be one thing, many things? If you want it to for your livestock or for wildlife, you're going to want some thorns in there so that your animals can't get through it, or they don't want to because of the thorns, or they won't eat it because of the thorns. And for small birds and other little creatures that you might want to enhance your property for, they like thorns to help protect them from predators. And of course, if you're doing this for the beauty of a hedgerow, you could plan the plants to put into your hedgerow for seasonal interest. You might want something that has like the red osier dogwood with the red bark so that you have that in the winter time. You might want the red flowering currant so you have those beautiful pink flowers attracting hummingbirds in the spring, in the summertime. So lots of planning can go into that. So the boring stuff, the budget. A hedgerow could cost a lot of money. There's certainly labor involved, and there's definitely labor involved if you're going to rip out something that maybe is like a hedgerow that you may currently have of just blackberries. There's going to be a lot of labor involved in that initially, and then as well for maintenance over the next few years to make sure those blackberries just don't take over your new investment of your beautiful hedgerow. Do you want your hedgerow to be big right away, or are you happy planting little plants and watching it grow over the next few years? One big thing is if you do have livestock, you might want some temporary fencing to ensure your livestock can't get to your new living fence until your living fence has established itself. So more prices. Then beyond that, we got 800 years to maintain these things. So you might want to put an 800-year budget in. I'm just kidding, but you know what I mean. It's a long term. So budget stuff over. The fun stuff is what kind of plants do you want to put into your hedgerow? We certainly encourage indigenous plants. You can certainly plant ornamental plants, but you want to make sure that whatever you're planting is not invasive. So beyond the blackberries and the Japanese knotweed that you really certainly don't want to plant there. Make sure you're not planting other things. Like we do have some very aggressive plants that like to get saplings from the roots. Like you wouldn't want to plant a rubinia or a black locust, right, in your hedgerow, because that's just going to start poking up new plants into your field, and you certainly don't want to have to maintain those. So be careful when you're choosing what you'd like to plant. Make sure it's something that's not going to be invasive for your field. You don't want to plant anything that's going to be a host plant for a pest species. If you're growing something that a certain plant or certain pest likes to live on and eat, so they can then lay all their babies on your plants and then they'll destroy them. Make sure you're not planting any of those plants. You want something that's easy to take care of. If you want your livestock to be able to eat the plant when it's done, then make sure you're planting whatever that is. And as I mentioned before, overhead wires. How tall do you want the hedgerow to be? Do you want it to be all trees, or do you want just shrubs? So check out that. Oh, how to maximize your hedgerow. Of course, we would like it if your hedgerow was excellent for wildlife of runoff from your fields or any agricultural practices. Biggest thing is making sure you have a good diversity of plants in your hedgerow. You want indigenous plants if you can. We definitely push them. They're the best suited for growing in our environment. We really love it if you could put trees in. Trees get the deep roots. They definitely help if you have a stream to try and hold that thing together for you. The deep roots are also better for helping your enhance your soils around the area. Those deep roots pull up nutrients from that soil and release it into their leaves. A beautiful big leaf maple in a hedgerow would be fabulous to be able to enhance your soils all around that. Thorny stuff, as I mentioned before, evergreen trees that are spiky, really great. Some spruce, that'd be great. Birds love that in the winter time. We want to plant what's called shoulder species if you're hoping to enhance an area for pollinators. What a shoulder species is, it's like something like Saskatoon berry, where it blooms early in the season so that our native bumblebees have something to eat before all of the crops are ready to be pollinated and to eat. So you plant your Saskatoon berry, your native bees can then eat the Saskatoon berry, the pollen, and they can head out into the fields and pollinate, and then they can come back, and then a late blooming plant in your hedgerow to help support them at the end of the season before they head off and hibernate or die. And speaking of pollinators, we suggest if you can plant in what we call clumps. So if you plant Saskatoon berry, don't plant one, here and then 10 meters away, plant another Saskatoon berry, and then another 10 meters, another Saskatoon berry. If you could plant all of those in one area, your pollinator then goes to each of those Saskatoon berries, and it doesn't have to use up a lot of extra energy moving from this Saskatoon berry to the one that's way down there. So it's better for them. And then, of course, if you can plant, if you want to, you can plant plants that could maybe make some money. As I mentioned, you're maintaining this thing for the next 800 years. Moneymaker plants really aren't going to make you a lot of money unless you really are maintaining this thing for profit. But these could maybe help offset the expenses of having a hedgerow, such as food, lots of berries, the Saskatoon berries, fabulous. Rose hips are great. There's a lot of herbologists, I can't think of the word. Anyway, people that like all these things like stinging nettles and that type of stuff for whatever kind of cool mixture. And you can plant flowers that could be harvested and sold. Hedgerows, of course, originally started out as, or not originally started, they started as fences, but they were used for fuel wood, so coppicing or plarding. Coppicing's down on the ground where they would have cut the plant at the ground, and then it would have shot up new shoots over the next 3-4 years, and those ones get cut off again. Plarding is when it's cut higher up so that your animals can't eat them. But maybe you need fuel wood. Maybe not right now because we have all sorts of opportunities to warm our houses, but who knows in the next 800 years what we might need wood for. Decorative branches, I know my mother loved these things. She's always looking for corkscrew willows and stuff to decorate in the house. There are still places that sell lovely decorative branches, and you can plant that kind of thing and then sell it. And then of course there's live stakes. Live stakes are plants that grow from shoots, usually done through coppicing, such as willows and that kind of stuff. And then those are actually sold. And speaking of live stakes, if you want to make a hedgerow maybe on a budget to be able to keep it a little bit cheaper, you can actually use live stakes to help you out with that. A live stake, basically, it's a branch that you've cut off of another bush or something like that, and you stick that branch in the ground, and it will actually root and produce a whole new plant for you. It's pretty exciting. They have about a 50 to 80% survival rate, depending on the species that you choose. They like the wet or moist soils. They need the wetter soils to be able to produce their roots, that type of thing. I put a list here of a lot of the different species that work really well. The list is mostly in order from left to right. You would have the same left to right of willows and cottonwood are very successful. Nootka rose and red flowering currants are only about 50% successful. Generally, you just plant your whips. You plant more of them, so you end up with the amount of plants in the end that's depending on the math. And these are fabulous. You might even have some of these plants already on your property that you could use for whips. So then you may get a free hedgerow, which would be fabulous. Just a little bit of labor involved, but labor of love, right? One thing that's, of course, that needs to be spoken about when it comes to planting plants along our creeks, especially in Langley, is beaver. They create beautiful wetlands that are very, very valuable for us. They're very valuable for climate change. They're very for taking care of carbon, all sorts of fabulous things. But a lot of this land we're talking about is very productive food land. And so if you are concerned about beaver, you can actually work with planting species that maybe beaver don't like to eat, such as our conifers. They do like cedars. I have found that they like cedars, but they're not particularly fond of most conifers. Red orchard dogwood, the 9-bark, and the red elderberry are all ones that could actually grow through whips as well, as I mentioned before. So an option. You could also fence off your plants so that the beaver can't get them. But we're trying to make a living, we fence, and then we fence out the plants. But still makes a good hedgerow. So if you're making a new hedgerow, you'll want to make sure you budget for about 3 to 5 years of fairly intensive maintenance, which will probably require weeding, potentially mulch, replacement of any dead trees. If you do decide to put in some more expensive trees into a hedgerow, you may want to make sure you have a watering schedule. Make sure your watering schedule doesn't start in August after we haven't had any rain. Watering schedules should start in June to make sure that your plants are well rooted and ready to go. And keep watering them into the drier months. Mentioned before, maybe some fencing to keep livestock away from your hedgerow while it's getting established, and then yearly checks. And then it's usually suggested to trim your hedgerow maybe every 2 to 3 years if needed. So the final note for fab foliage fences, I truly had to. You don't want to overmanage these things. Your hedgerow and streamside vegetation, these aren't your standard cedar hedges. These are supposed to look rather wild and be happy and growing all over the place within the boundary you wish to keep it. And don't manage the hedgerows during nesting season. It's, if you are trying to bring in wildlife and that type of thing, birds are quite vulnerable if you end up going in there and trimming them back during the nesting season, which is considered April until the end of August. Anything dead in your hedgerow are actually considered somewhat valuable. If you could leave those, if they're not a hazard, that would be wonderful. The thought is actually that dead tree has more living cells in it than a living tree, just because of the amount of life that a dead tree does host, which is great. And try not to manage your hedgerow with fertilizers and pesticides. You may have noted a couple of the different images that I had in my presentation. I got them all off of Google Earth. I just wanted to note that there are hedgerows outside of England. They're all over the world, and just takes a little bit looking for them, but it's kind of neat to find these things everywhere. And I did want to make sure I included, the hedgerows that you would have seen in Downton Abbey and the beautiful patchwork that's out there in England. And then if anyone's a fan of Doc Martin, it is filmed in Port Isaac. And I had to include the hedgerow for Port Isaac as well. As Amanda mentioned earlier, we do have more hedgerows, more webinars coming up, and we'd love to have you out for those. And if you are a farmer and haven't had a site consultation with us yet, there are more slots for site consultations until the end of February. Contact Amanda if you have any questions.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Does anybody have any questions for Lisa at all about hedgerows? Now is the time.
I have one. It's Carly.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is there any like grants available for this kind of like, I guess, changing your kind of like your style of farming. If that makes any sense? Like to just sort of like change the land that you're farming on to make it a little more.
Yep, there certainly are.
Or like
Amanda, did you
that.
want to address that?
Oh, no, you go right ahead, Lisa. Like, I know I do know some initiatives, but you may have a few more.
No, not many, but like the environmental farm plan, you can certainly get in with them. It has that is one of the things that they will fund is trying to get this kind of stuff in. And there are different initiatives, especially if you have a creek that you could apply for funding to be able to enhance the creek on your property too. Or you find a group like LEPS or Fraser Valley Conservancy or another one like that, if you're willing to let volunteers come out to help you out, then sometimes that's a great opportunity too.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
I didn't know about LEPS, but I do work with Fraser Valley Conservancy, and you probably do the same thing, but if you sign up to be a steward, they'll come out and they'll provide the plants and do the planting and get you going. And we've done extensive planting all along our sloughs, and we formed groups out in Chilliwack that are trying to improve the quality, the riparian zones along all the sloughs. So, I mean, there's lots of grants out there. If you're a dairy farmer, there's currently a program that will supply funds for climate change issues, and that includes cover crops, but also planting along your fence lines. So if you're a dairy farmer, you can get that going.
Excellent. Thank you, Janice. Any other questions?
Okay, well, I'll stop the recording now. If there's any more that kind of pop up, if I find that, here we go.